It's running. Okay, so good evening to everyone. We are on Megillah, chapter 4, Mishnah 1. And we are picking up where we left off. But as I've said before, where we leave off in this section of Mishnah is not always going to tell you what's coming next. This Mishnah is a collection of different laws and different ideas. We are going to continue with the idea of reading. That is to say, reading from Torah, reading from other texts within this. And you may find in chapter 4 a number of things that are very, very similar to what we still do now. For example, the number of readings we do on a regular day or on a Shabbat or a holiday. But there will be other things that are not the way we do them now. And we'll talk about how they've changed and why they've changed. So with that in mind, we're going to hit it. So chapter 4, Mishnah 1. And I need a volunteer to read.
Okay.
Judy, thank you.
Okay. Mishnah 1. He who reads the Megillah may either stand or sit.
All right. So nowadays, our custom is to have people stand when reading from the Megillah. But this is a difference, because if you're reading from the Torah, you must stand. But reading from the Megillah, because it is a slightly lower level of sanctity, you can stand or sit. But the custom nowadays is to definitely stand. But the Mishnah is showing the difference between the two types of readings. Make sense? Pretty straightforward. Part 2.
Whether one read it or two read it together, they, that is those listening, have fulfilled their obligation.
All right, so let me explain a little bit. We're not talking about what you'll usually see at our Megillah readings, which is where you have one person read a section, and then another person read a section, and then another person read a section. Everybody knows that's fine. What they're talking about here is a duet, people reading in unison. So this might have been used to amplify the volume, because then it makes it louder for other people to hear. Might have been done because it was prettier, like a choir type singing. But when it comes for the Torah reading, this is not allowed. This is why for a Torah reading, we don't get two people up there reading the words together. Even though it might sound good, it doesn't happen. And that's because the Talmud explains, when two people read, there's always a chance of a blurring of what you hear, because one person may be a little earlier and one person may be reading a little bit slower, and there's just enough fuzziness that there could be a problem. And for the Torah, we want everything to be perfectly clear. So that's the law. But for the Megillah, if it's a little fuzzy at the edges, that's okay. Right? So you can have a multi-choir singing of the Megillah. You can't do that of the Torah. Make sense? Got it. Onward.
In places where it is the custom to say a blessing, they say the blessing. And where it is not the custom, they do not say the blessing.
All right. So the Talmud again comes in to help us here. This is talking about the blessing for the Megillah after the reading of the Megillah. According to the Talmud, everybody agreed that you did an introductory blessing to the Megillah reading, which we still do. But the Megillah blessing that comes after the reading, after chapter 10, that did in some places, and sometimes other people didn't. And that was, is that someone trying the door? I told you he had a key. Then in whatever the custom was in your place, then that's what you followed. So people would, he has his own copy, so people would either after or not, but everybody would do the blessing before the Megillah reading. So that makes the blessing after customary. Chapter 4, Mishnah 1. And then part 5, we're now switching gears a little bit.
We're on part 4.
Oh, sorry, part 4, still switching gears.
On Mondays and Thursdays, and on Shabbat at Mincha, 3 read from the Torah. They do not add to this number nor decrease from it, nor do they conclude with a haftarah from the prophets. Okay, so this is going to start a topic, but I want to make sure that we get the idea here clear.
Mishnah 1.
Mishnah 1, yeah. Read 1. Read 3. Okay. In our modern services, we don't follow this pattern. In our modern services, we have bless one, bless one. We have one person who blesses before and after, and we have a reader that reads for them in between, right? And then we do the same for 2 and 2, right? They bless before, they bless after, and 3 and 3, they bless before, they bless after. That was not how it worked in the Mishnah's times. In the Mishnah's time, they did not know of having other people saying a blessing. The person who read was the person who maybe did the blessing, because even the blessing wasn't universal. That is to say, what they usually would do is they would say a blessing at the start, and they'd say a blessing after the last aliyah. But the person reading was the person with the honor. It was not a split honor with one person reading, one person blessing. And that was because back then, most people knew how to read. That was common. If you were within the community and you were knowledgeable at all of Torah, you knew how to read it. And therefore, you didn't need a surrogate reader. You didn't need a stand-in reader. You'd be able to read it for yourself. And that was the common. But as time went on, even by the time of the Talmud, more and more people were not able to read for themselves. And this would mean that they were cut off from being able to have that honor, to participate in the learning of the Torah. And so the blessing was separated from the reading and was given more status. And that then became the focus. And then people who were specialized readers would do the official reading. Make sense? And so already during this time period, from the Mishnah through the Talmud, there was a general decrease in Jewish literacy as an average expectation. It doesn't mean people stopped being Jewish. It just meant that the ability of them to just open the Torah and start chanting, remember, no vowels, no trope marks on your average Torah, that skill level had begun to decrease. Now, one of the reasons that skill level had begun to decrease as an average expectation is because the number of people who were following Rabbinic Judaism, right? Think of it this way. Imagine you got a team of 10 players, and this is your NBA All-Star, or however many people you have on a basketball team, right? And these are the 10 best players in the entire sport. That's great, right? And if you ask how many of you can hit a home run, how many of you can, throw a football 100 yards, how many of you can make a basket from 3 points, pick your sport. All of them are going to say, yeah, I can do that, because these are like the best of the best. But if you take your team of 10 and you expand it to 100 and include a bunch of just regular people, all of a sudden the percentage of people on the team who can make the home run, throw the football, hit the 3-point shot, your percentage of people who can do it has just dropped through the floor. Now, you're still going to want to teach them, you want to improve them, you want to make them get up there, but in the meantime, you also want them to game. You want them to be part of the team. And so this system of adding in extra blessings is incorporated in order to help lift the people who are joining. And this is partly because Rabbinic Judaism was the surviving form of Judaism. And as those who attached themselves to Rabbinic Judaism carried on, our numbers grew relative to the small number of Rabbinic Jews who were very dedicated in the early days of the Mishnah and even before. Sense that what was expected in the early days of a small group was not possible for the larger nation as it became the common practice of the larger nation after the temple was destroyed, after the Roman persecutions, and after our foundation had been shaken. This changed the whole demographics of who was participating in what. Make sense? Maybe? Okay. In that case, hit part 5.
Part 5, the one who begins the Torah reading and the one who concludes the Torah reading blesses before it and after it.
Which is what I had just described of the blessing at the top and the blessing at the bottom, right? They bless at the very beginning of the aliyot, and then another person, number 3, would bless at the very end of the aliyot, but they didn't used to make blessings in the middle.
We've done when we've done the Megillah, where the person who's reading the first part says the blessing before
Exactly.
it. and the one who reads the last part recite the blessing after, and however many people we have reading in between don't
Right.
read the blessings.
That was exactly what the ancient Torah reading would have looked like. Is exactly that model, that you would have had one blessing from one person who read the first piece, and then however many people reading in the middle, and all of them just reading with no additional blessings being said, until the last one who reads the last verse and then does a blessing afterwards. Now, there's one other line here that we need to get clear before we move on, because this is going to come up as a major distinction when we hit Shabbat. And that is, on an average Monday, Thursday, right, with no other holiday, no Rosh Chodesh, nothing else going on, just a regular weekday, we have 3 aliyot. And as it says, you can neither add nor subtract from that. Now, subtract, I think we can all understand, right? Of course, you're not going to cut the Torah down. You've got to do the minimum that the Torah is asking for. But can't we add to it? You know, we like Torah. Maybe we want to have 4 readings. Maybe we want to have 5 readings. Let's have 20 readings. Well, let's add more. There are a couple problems with that. We're going to see eventually with Shabbat, and only Shabbat, can you add. But on all other holidays, it's limited to whatever the precise number is. Part of the problem is, especially on weekdays, is that there's a limited amount of time. People need to daven, they need to do the prayers, and they need to go off to work. And if you add more and more and more, then that makes it harder for people who are working to be able to work and come to the prayers. The limit, people know, okay, it's only going to be 40 minutes, 45 minutes. I can still do my job and get there on time. If you add another 10, then now it's taking way too long. But that doesn't explain why we limit on Pesach, why we limit on Sukkot, why we limit on Rosh Hashanah. Let's have 10 aliyot on Rosh Hashanah. Then we can give out more honors. To have an honor on Rosh Hashanah? The problem with doing it that way is that if you add in extra honors or extra aliyot, then eventually Shabbat is no longer unique. You're turning other holidays into Shabbat. And the number of aliyot that we have is an indicator of the inherent holiness of the day. That is to say, the more holy a day, the more readings from the Torah we have. So if you were to add to the other days, you would be imitating Shabbat, which removes the distinction of levels of Shabbat. Shabbat has to remain the top. Right? Shabbat is the #1 Jewish holiday. I know people tend to think like Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, maybe Pesach, but Shabbat is the #1 Jewish holiday, and the number of readings is meant to preserve that unique status for Shabbat. We'll see as we turn the page. Mishnah 2.
Why you cannot conclude from the prophet?
Same reason was in the ancient world. If you read from the prophets, that would add additional time for a weekday. And as we're going to see for the other holidays, it wasn't normal to include, but they could. We'll see in Mishnah 2. You'll see there's a what do you call it? A gradient. There's a variety of what we can and can't include. So let's get Mishnah 2, and then we'll get the full picture.
Part 1. On Rosh Chodesh and on the intermediate days of festivals, read 4. They do not add to this number nor decrease from it, nor do they conclude with a haftarah from the prophets. The one who begins the Torah reading and the one who concludes the Torah reading blesses before it and after it. This is the general rule. On any day which has a musaf and is not a festival, read 4.
All right. So we add another reading because it is Rosh Chodesh, or because it is a Chol HaMoed. It is an intermediate day of one of the festivals, meaning Sukkot or Pesach. But those are better than a regular day. They're better than a Monday or Thursday, but they're not as better as some of the other holidays. Reading, but we still do not add in a reading from the Haftarah, from the prophets. However,
on a festival, 5.
Right, so that's Shavuot, Sukkot, Pesach. Those are the 3 festivals.
On Yom HaKippurim, 6.
Right, Yom HaKippurim is even a higher level of sanctity than Rosh Hashanah, and so we would read 6 from that. But you'll notice, on the festivals and on Yom Kippur, no mention's been made of the Haftarah. Right, it doesn't say to or not to. But the general rule is that we now do. It was not required for the longest time at Haftarah in the Mishnah time, in a later Mishnah tonight, I hope. So we'll save how they did their Haftarot for a little bit later in the discussion. Let's hit Shabbat.
On Shabbat 7, they may not decrease from this number, but they may add to it, and they conclude with a Haftarah from the prophets. The one who begins the Torah reading and the one who concludes the Torah reading blesses before it and after it.
All right, so the blessing is still standing the same, but now on Shabbat we're up to 7 Haftarah, so that we get what we are now familiar with our regular Shabbat. Now, if you wanted to have an 8th Aliyah, or a 9th Aliyah, or a 10th Aliyah, you can do that on Shabbat. So, in fact, in Baltimore, this was, when the synagogue I worked for, this was a normal Shabbat when there would be a bar mitzvah for 2 families, or there were 4 aliyot for 1 family, 4 aliyot for 1 family, and 1 aliyah for the congregation at large. We would always add 1 more reading. We would divide one of the aliyot in order to make sure there were basically 9 aliyot for the entire morning as being one of those aliyot. And that was just standard, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to give enough honors to both families and still have an honor for the congregation. Make sense? Maybe? All right, so you can add and add and add and add on Shabbat, but you can't do that on other holidays. One place where this is a very noticeable effect is on Simchat Torah. On Simchat Torah, where we want everybody to have an aliyah, you might think the easiest solution is to just keep having more aliyot. But we don't. Right? The way we do more aliyot is by repeating the same aliyah rather than adding new material, because otherwise we would be breaking this rule, which is an interesting rabbinic compromise, and also shows you how late Simchat Torah came as a set of customs for the holiday. Good? Nay? Nay? Hopefully this sounds very familiar, but also just a little bit different, because, you know, we have tweaked things.
Thinking about maftir for holidays, like.
So maftir doesn't count, right? Maftir is not in this cycle. Maftir is over here, because maftir is an appendage of the Haftarah. Maftir is not an additive to the Torah reading. It is sometimes added just as a holiday echo, that is to say, thematically for the holiday or the calendar. But the main job of maftir is to allow whoever's reading the Haftarah a chance to read from the Torah in order to show respect to the Torah, not only to show respect to the books of the prophets. So maftir is not counted as part of the official count. That's why it's not called the 8th Aliyah. That's why it's called maftir. And we're going to talk more about some of the uniquenesses of maftir and the Haftarah combo when we talk about who can chant it. So let's first talk about generally who can do some of the different jobs. So this is chapter 4, Mishnah 3. And right now we're going to talk about what you need a minyan for. But since it doesn't tell you that you need a minyan until the very end, I'm going to give you that spoiler at the beginning. This list that we are about to have in Mishnah 3 is a list of who or what things we need a minyan for.
They do not recite the Shema responsively.
All right, we don't recite the Shema responsively at all. But apparently there was a system. This is actually discussed in lots of different commentary, but the version that they describe here is there was a system in the Mishnaic world of doing the Shema call and response, where the leader would do half of a verse and the congregation would respond with the next half of the verse. We don't do that at all, but apparently in the ancient world, before they would do that special system, they needed a minyan. So not terribly relevant to us now, but it was one of the things that needed a minyan. The others you'll notice more clearly once I translate.
They do not pass before the ark.
All right, so passing before the ark is the rabbinic jargon for leading the Amidah, for doing the Shemona Esrei, the middle section of the service, the pinnacle. on Shabbat, Baruch atah, da, 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 da. The person who leads that you need a minyan for leading it. You don't need a minyan to do the Amidah privately, but if you're doing the Amidah together, which means you're including the Kedusha, Kadosh, 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 then you need 10 people to be there for that to happen as a public prayer. Sound familiar?
And the priests do not lift up their hands.
So this is talking about Birkat HaKohanim, about the priestly blessing. Their hands to do the blessing. You only do that with a minyan. If you don't have a minyan, the Kohanim do not do that prayer.
Okay. They do not read the Torah publicly.
Right. Obviously, you can read Torah privately and study Torah at any time with one person or however many. But for doing the Torah reading as a community, you need a minyan to read Torah.
Not conclude with a haftarah from the prophets.
So you might have thought that even though we can't read from the Torah, maybe we can read from Isaiah, Ezekiel, or one of the others. But no, you need a minyan for that as well.
They do not make stops at funeral processions.
So you've probably noticed that when we have a Jewish funeral, the custom is to take 7 stops, pauses in the carrying of the aron, the casket, to the grave, only with a minyan. Now, I can't remember the last funeral I've been at that had fewer than 10 people, but that could be an issue if you were in a small town of not making those stops. Part 7.
They do not say the blessing for mourners, or the comfort of mourners, or the blessing of bridegrooms.
All right, so this is not talking about the mourner's Kaddish. This is talking about special blessings that used to be said for those that were mourning. The mourner's Kaddish is a much later invention, an adaptation of the Kaddish blessing. But at this time, it did not exist in the way we recognize. So what they're talking about here is special blessings that were said to the mourners, not blessings said by the mourners. And again, much for the same reason why the Kaddish was picked for mourners later on. By having a community, you create that comfort, that assistance to those that are mourning, so that their grief can have some help from the people around them. And so too, the celebration of the bridegroom, of the chuppah, needs a community to really be celebrated properly. If you get married without a minyan, it still counts as a marriage, but from the start, we should always try to make sure we have a minyan for a wedding. How are we doing? Okay. 8.
And they do not mention God's name in the invitation to say Birkat Hamazon.
Right. You may have noticed in the little booklet that we use for our bencher for Birkat Hamazon, when we're together, that there's a little word in brackets, Eloheinu, right? We add the word Eloheinu when we have 10 or more, word out when we have fewer than 10.
So if you don't have a minyan, you can marriage.
I know. If you don't have a minyan, it's better to get a minyan, but if you do the ceremony anyway, you're still married. Right? That's what we say tofes. It still counts as a wedding, but it is proper and appropriate to have a wedding, to have a minyan for the wedding.
So what are the wedding blessings?
So again, there's debate about whether the Mishnah is talking about the full Sheva Brachot that we know, or whether at the time of the Mishnah there were fewer blessings that were being said. But we, of course, now use the Sheva Brachot. That's the area that we would be talking about. And then part 9. Oh, sorry, yeah.
Oh, I didn't finish.
Oh, you didn't do the part A. Okay. Well, we've been talking.
God's name in the invitation to say Birkat Hamazon, except in the presence of 10.
Right. So actually, that except in the presence of 10 covers everything between 1 and 8. Right, from the top all the way through 8, all of those are except in the presence of 10. You don't do Shema responsibly, don't pass in front of the ark, except in the presence of 10. We need a minyan for all of it. Right? Good.
Okay.
But now a slight difference.
Part 9. For redeeming sanctified land, 9 and a priest are sufficient, and similarly with human beings.
All right, so when you need to get the valuation in order to redeem something that had been dedicated for the temple, you can do it with 9 regular people plus a priest in order for making that valuation that you will then have to pay the redemption value of. And the same thing for a person. Not that you would ever sacrifice a person, but there were certain types of vows known as an erech vow, not a vowel, that would be based on the valuation of a person. And again, you could do that valuation with 10 people, with 9 plus a priest in order to make that estimate. Make sense? Not something that comes up nowadays. Not come up for a few thousand years, but that's what they're talking about here. Good? Good. Mishnah 4. Now back to something we're a little more familiar with.
One who reads the Torah in public may not read less than 3 verses.
All right, so if you've ever wondered, why is it that some aliyot are 20 verses long and some aliyot are 5 verses long and some aliyot are 3 verses long, is only 2 verses long, it's for this reason, right? For an aliyah, you have to have a minimum of 3 verses to make an aliyah. That is the minimum linguistic unit that's considered a reasonable unit of meaning within the Torah reading. And so if you go through, you'll notice that that is, in fact, very true. And if you ever are adding additional verses, you have to make sure that when you add at least 3 verses, that they have to have 3. You'll notice as well for the maftir often will be a very, very short version of number 7, but it will never be fewer than 3 verses. It'll always have at least those 3. Good, good. And now something totally different from what we're used to.
And he should not read to the translator more than 1 verse at a time. But if reading from the book of a prophet, he may read to him 3 at a time. All
right, so they used to have what was known as a meturgaman, right? A translator that was literally standing next to the table where the Torah was being read. And the Torah reader would read 1 verse, and then he would translate. And the Torah reader would read the next verse, and then he would translate. And the next verse, and translate. And the next verse, and translate. And you're not allowed, from this Mishnah, to read verses 1 and 2, and then make him translate verse 1 and 2. It has to be 1 verse at a time. Because otherwise, how can you hope for him to remember correctly? Right? The whole point of having the translator is so everyone can understand. But if you read too much and he has to paraphrase, then we've defeated the whole purpose. And the translation was live. He wasn't reading from a script. He was translating it from what he heard, from what you just read, so that the congregation would know what was read, because no one had one of these in their lap. Right? This is such a modern gift. But for most of the history, and especially at the time of Mishnah, nobody had a Chumash in their lap. They listened. If they understood the Hebrew, great. If they didn't, they needed the translator. And the translator had to do it live because he didn't have a copy of a translation. And therefore, he would give it verse by verse by verse. So you can imagine, this might make the Torah reading a little longer. If you have it being done basically in simultaneous translation. It's like having closed captions for the Torah reading.
What about the reader, him or herself, translating?
Usually, I'm not sure if it was allowed or not, but the general idea was no. Because one of the other purposes was that the translator had to translate what was read. And that was another check to make sure that what was read correctly. So that the translator translates it and it's wrong, then you know that the person, would be one more way to check to make sure that it was going to be read right. So people go, wait a minute, I don't remember anything about, doing that. Then that means that it was read incorrectly and it has to be fixed. So having a person translate for themselves, well, we all know what we thought we meant to say, and you lose that process of having an additional brain checking what was just read. It's so bad to try and proofread your own work. It's just, you never see your own mistakes as well as you can find someone else's. So yeah, you would have this translator. Now with the prophets, in the Haftarah, you would read 3 verses, and that was fine. It's a poetic unit. It's a little bit more loose in the translation because some of the poetry of the prophets is hard to translate precisely into any language. And that meant that you could go for larger blocks and still allow it. However, part A.
However, if the 3 verses constitute 3 separate paragraphs, he must read them to the translator one by one.
There are certain places in the prophets each line is its own discrete section, and that needs to be read, translate, translate, translate. You'll notice in the commentary in my book and our copy, it specifically talks about Isaiah 52, verses 3 through 5. A unique line, and therefore has to be read and translated as a unique line. Good. Part 3.
Okay, part 3. They may skip from place to place in a prophet, but not in the Torah.
So if you've ever been reading along with the Haftarah, you may have noticed that it can jump from one part of a prophet to another part, to a whole nother book of prophets. One of the most famous is, of course, the reading for Yom Kippur afternoon of Mincha. We read from the book of Jonah all the way through, and then we finish off with 3 verses from Micah. That's allowed in the books of the prophets, not allowed when reading from the Torah. You're not allowed to just jump from place to place to place in the Torah. When it comes to the Torah reading, everything we have to read. No deletion is allowed. And then this is a really interesting line from how the ancient world used to work.
How far may he skip in the prophet? Only so far that the translator will not have stopped before he finds his place.
Okay, so this is where I get to explain that in the Mishnah's time, the readings for the Haftarah, the readings from the prophets, were not 100% fixed in stone. They were not in a neat little chart like they are in our Chumash that tells you this is exactly what you read for each Torah portion and each holiday. It was up to the individual reader. Whoever was given the honor of reading the Haftarah could pick what he wanted to read for that day. Now, over the centuries, we narrowed it down to the Ashkenazic and Sephardic versions of this, and most of those agree, even between those two communities. But during the Mishnah's time, you could pick. Now, if it's your turn to pick, and you get up there and you start reading, and you want to skip ahead, that's okay, but you can only skip ahead in the scroll as long as it takes the translator to finish translating what you just finished. And once he's done, you better be ready to read again. So you can't read like 5 verses and then say, hold on, and then roll all the way through to the end of Ezekiel and then keep reading. No, you can skip a chapter, maybe 2 chapters, but because we're not dealing with books, but dealing with scrolls, of how far can you roll in order to get ready for the next section you want to do. And this is trying to put a limit on how far that can go. Now, in the modern world, in our Chumashim, for most of our time, we now have separate books and separate scrolls, or they had separate scrolls of separate books. So we even have skips that go between books. Rather than reading all from one book, sometimes we'll read from multiple books, especially from the minor prophets, from the 12 prophets, the guys who wrote shorter books. But in the ancient world, if you're reading from one book of the prophets and you're deciding where you want to read that day, you cannot skip too much territory. Why? Because it is a tircha. It is a burden to the community to sit there, and they're waiting. This is the same reason, by the way, why it's mandatory to have 3 kosher Torahs. Because even though sometimes the maftir is from, even though the maftir is found in the same Torah that the main part of the Torah reading was from, if you had to wait for us to go from Genesis all the way to Numbers in order to read the Rosh Chodesh section, that would make you sit there for a good 5 to 10 minutes, depending upon how fast we can roll. It is not appropriate to make the community have to wait. So we have a second Torah that is already rolled so we can go. And you need 3 because sometimes there are a couple times when you might need 3 Torahs. Like, for example, Rosh Chodesh Hanukkah. You always need 3 Torahs to make sure you get all 3 sections read. Make sense? All right, we roll on. Mishnah 5.
Mishnah 5. The one who concludes with the Haftarah also reads the responsive reading of the Shema, and he passes before the ark and he lifts up his hands.
Go ahead and read part 2 as well.
If he is a child, his father or his teacher passes before the ark in his place.
Okay, so here's the question, which is, if I read the Haftarah, what other jobs am I fit to do? And they're saying that if you read the Haftarah, then of course you can also do that Shema reading, you can also pass before the ark, meaning the Amidah, and you can also do the blessing of the Kohanim if you're a Kohen. Part 2, they introduced this issue of what happens if it was a kid, because a child was allowed to read the Haftarah, right? You didn't have to be an adult to read the Haftarah. That was always very, very clear and has remained clear all the way up until today, and I'll prove that in just a second. But if a child had been the one who read the Haftarah, then of course you can't have him going up and doing the Amidah, because you can't lead an Amidah and make everyone else be discharge their duty unless you have that duty. And a child is not obligated to that responsibility, right? Unless you are responsible for the same duty, you cannot help others fulfill that duty by doing the prayer to which they say Amen. It's kind of like, let me give you a clearer example. If we were in the sanctuary and it was time to do the motzi, right? And let's imagine you don't know how to say the motzi for yourself. So you're waiting and you're listening for the blessing so that when we finish, you can say Amen, and that means you've said the blessing, right? That's what Amen can do, is it means you've done the blessing even if you couldn't say the words. If I was at the front of the room and I led you in the blessing, but I didn't eat, that would not count. That's not doing the blessing. That's teaching the blessing, and that's fine, but I would not be doing the blessing. I would simply be saying words, because you can't do a blessing without doing the action. So in order for you to be okay with the Amen to my blessing, I have to be actually doing it. Since a child is not obligated to do the Amidah until they're bar and bat mitzvah age, then they cannot lead us in the Amidah to which we would say Amen, because their words are lovely, but their words are not doing a duty. They're not doing a mitzvah at that moment. So therefore, they cannot carry me with their performance. Following the logic? Kind of? It's kind of like you got to be a full member of the group to do one of the jobs of the group. It's like, we're not going to make anybody a member of our board if they're not a member of the congregation. If you're not a member of the congregation, you can't become a member of the board, because the members of the board, they're doing jobs for the congregation. And you got to be a member before you can do a job on behalf of the group. Can't vote unless you're a citizen. But what is it about the child doing the Haftarah? Why would we allow them to do that? Well, we do allow them to do that because the Haftarah is not an obligatory part of the service. It is an obligation now, but it is not a Torah obligation. And you'll notice that we don't say Asher Kidishanu, right? We don't say that God commanded us to read from the Haftarah. If you're wondering, we do say that about Torah study, but we say that at the very beginning of our preliminary prayers, rather than at the aliyah for each one. But we do say that the Torah is a mitzvah, but we don't say that the Haftarah is a mitzvah. Therefore, a child can do it. And in fact, that was why children were given the Haftarah and the maftir for their bar and bat mitzvah. Because then even if perhaps this child was especially late in entering puberty, and therefore not actually officially a member of the adult group, and therefore could not officially do these other jobs, this they could still do on behalf of the congregation. Does that make sense? Because it was bonus and outside that realm of absolute obligation, they could do it. And that was why the maftir and the haftarah was reserved now, bat mitzvah, within the community. That way we don't have to physically check if they have entered puberty. It was safe to give that to them. Now, nowadays, in the modern world where puberty for most children begins very, very early, it's not much of an issue. But in the ancient world where puberty could often be delayed because of famine and other difficulties, having to check every single child to see if they have developed physically into puberty would have been a bit of a problem. So it was easier to just give them something that was clearly okay, even if a child was doing it. And that way we could allow them to have that bar and bat mitzvah moment. How are we doing? Following Jewish logic?
That was a little radical.
Well, we tend not to think of it that way.
Yeah, we think of it now as this is the marker that this child has reached adulthood.
And
because the definition, the way we think of it now, is a little bit different of when the child reaches adulthood. Maybe not by Jewish law, but culturally.
Exactly, and that's a very long standing. We culturally, a long time, a couple thousand years, have adopted a fixed age rather than an individual's physical development as being the marker of adulthood. But this halakha recognized that the physical development does still matter with regards to whether the child is 100% absolutely in the eyes of physics an adult, as opposed to the eyes of the community. But because the community is not going to be checking the physical signs, we do culturally accept that this is the level at which we will now treat you as an adult within the community. So it is one more example that sometimes we will establish a certain parameter, even though there might be a slightly more precise physical definition. Physical definition creates other problems. We go with our parameter that supersedes that physical measurement. This happens in kashrut, it happens in Shabbat issues. Sometimes we go with a more easily maintained community standard than a more precise physical measurement. But it's important to know what's communal standard and what's precise, even though we're not going to go back and start doing bodily inspections. Okay, Mishnah 6.
Mishnah 6. A child may read in the Torah and translate, but he may not pass before the ark or lift up his hands.
So this is a continuation of the theme from the last Mishnah, again saying that a child can read from the Torah, and they can even be the Meturgaman, they can even be the translator. But they're not allowed to lead the Amidah, and they're not allowed to do the blessing of the Kohanim. Good? Good. Part 2.
A person in rags may lead the responsive reading of the Shema and translate, but he may not read in the Torah, pass before the ark, or lift up his hands.
Right. So here the issue is not whether the person...
You didn't say before that can read the Haftarah, and now say that can read the Torah.
Yes. So for the Haftarah and the Maftir, those were always 100% clear that everyone could do. What we're going to see, not in this Mishnah, but in other parts of the Mishnah, that children, women, and were not allowed to read from the Torah because of cultural parameters. So this is explaining that by the halakha, yes, children could. But by cultural standards from other Mishnayot and then the Talmud, they say, from now on, we're not going to let women and children read because of the honor of the community. And that's a much larger discussion of why now, in the conservative movement, we allow women and children to read as the halakha originally stated. And it's mostly because for now, our honor is not hurt when a young person or a woman reads. In fact, we're very proud of when young people and women read. But for many hundreds of years in some communities, some men had very weak egos. And if a woman or child could read and they couldn't, they were deeply hurt. They were humiliated because, a woman can read, but I can't. And rather than fixing their own illiteracy, they were angry at other people who could do this. And so to keep people from being angry and unhappy, for those communities said, therefore we're not going to let women and children read. But as you can see here from this Mishnah, the halacha says, yes, it is okay for a child to read from the Torah. At its root, it is okay. But if the community is going to fight over it, then they backed off. But again, regardless of, it's not a question of honor, it's a question of enrollment in the adulthood. If they're a child, they definitely cannot lead the Amidah, and they definitely cannot do the priestly blessing. The person in rags, on the other hand, this is a different issue. They are clearly an adult, but because they are dressed so shabbily, it would be dishonor to the Torah or the community to let them have those other roles. They can still do the Shema, they can still do the translation of the Torah reading, but they can't be called up to do the actual reading. They can't do the leading of the Amidah, and they can't do the priestly blessing. Back to that concept of what happens when the community is uncomfortable with the person leading in a later Mishnah, but we'll get that on the table for the moment. And now we're going to hit a different topic.
A blind man may lead the responsive reading of the Shema and translate.
Okay, so a blind person could not read from the Torah because a blind person cannot read from the Torah. Right? Literally, they can't read from the Torah. They can remember the words of the Torah, and that's wonderful and great, but they can't read off the scroll. And that means that they're missing the important check to a faulty memory. The whole idea is not just that you repeat what you remember. The whole idea is that you are reading what is on the page. I know with every single of my bar and bat mitzvah students, I tell them over and over again, your Torah reading, learn your Torah reading. And when you're reading, read from the page. If you can close your eyes, don't. Keep them open, follow the words, read from the words, don't just read from memory. And for this, that was pointing out that they could lead the Shema and they could do the translation. Of course, they could do the translation. They can hear what the person is reading, and they can translate that into Aramaic, the language that was usually used in the ancient world. And the issue with regards to the reading of the Shema is they were also talking about the blessings around the Shema. So in the morning, what is the first blessing we say next to the Shema? Yotzer Or. Right? We say a blessing thanking God for creating light. So the issue was, can a blind person say a blessing thanking God for light? Think about that for a second. How can you thank God for light if you've never seen the light? Or if you're so blind now that the light doesn't help you? Does it make a difference to a blind person whether there's light or not?
Well, it depends on exactly how blind they are.
Blindness. Absolute, no visual input at all.
If they absolutely can't even see light, maybe the light doesn't mean anything to them.
If they're absolutely alone. But if they're not absolutely alone, then being in a lit world is better for them than being in a dark world, because the other people who can see to help. Right? When a person is blind, they may not be able to benefit directly from the light that is around them. Indirectly, because the light will benefit the other people, and the other people will benefit them. Right? If a blind person lived in a world without light, they would starve to death, because the people who can see would not be able to grow food and be able to help them have food. As a blind person, if left to their own, would starve to death in this world. But if a blind person lives in a world with people who have sight and who have light, the blind person can get food, and then the blind person can contribute to society in all the other ways they can. So they do benefit from light, even if their eyes don't see it directly. The idea that the sages had, and the Talmud goes into much more discussion about that idea, that even though the blind person may not benefit directly, they benefit indirectly, and that still makes light a blessing for them. Now, Rabbi Yehuda, he pushes back on this, but he doesn't win the argument, but he takes the position.
Says, One who has never seen the light from his birth may not lead the responsive reading of the Shema.
But he loses the argument. So he takes the position that if you've never, ever, ever seen light, meaning you were born blind, then no, you can't, because you don't really know how to say thank you for light. The sages disagree, because I do know how to say thank you for light, even if I haven't experienced it, because I know that my life is better because it exists, and that is sufficient for me. Thank you to God for having a good leader, even if I've never met the leader. Most people, when they say the prayers for the king during all the Middle Ages, they never met the king, but they could still be thankful there was a king, because the king kept the world from going into total anarchy, usually, give or take which king. But at least that was the idea. Make sense? Okay. Yeah, we got time for Mishnah 7, and that's going to push forward this position of, what about people who are different?
A priest whose hands are deformed should not lift up his hands to say the priestly blessing.
Go ahead and read Rabbi Yehuda's edition.
Rabbi Yehuda says, also one whose hands are colored with woad or matter should not lift up his hands, because this makes the congregation look at him.
All right, so priestly blessing structure of the Birkat HaKohanim, the whole way that this is put together is designed to erase the significance of the individual who is standing with their hands up and the talit on them doing the blessing. Because we're supposed to be reminded that the blessing is from God, not from this person. And there's a whole host of additional restrictions on who can and can't do this based on personality, based on their role within the community, and other issues as well. But there's two. Because if, when they lift up their hands are deformed, people are no longer thinking about God, they're now thinking about their hands. If they stand up there and they have these stains on their hands from woad and matter, which are apparently rather potent dyes that your hands will become permanently colored, then people will be looking at their hands, and they'll be looking at the person. They will not be looking at God. They will not be thinking about God. This is something that comes up in the Torah as well, that talks about the different priests and officiate at the sacrifices based on different physical deformities. And the idea was not to say that somehow their physical deformities made them unfit for God, but unfortunately their physical deformities made them unable. Their physical deformities made the population unable to get past them. And this is a very difficult compromise that sometimes we have to face, of how do we ensure that our own limitations don't prevent other people who have their limitations from moving past them. And this is a very real problem. And I should point out, this is something that is rather uniquely personal to me. As you may remember from one of my Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur Devars, I happen to have a physical deformity in my left hand. So, it's short and they're double jointed, and there's a little webbing thing going on here, and it's smaller. It's a genetic defect called Poland's anomaly. And I sympathize with the priests who might have a deformity. Many people have many more severe deformities. My drum instructor, when I was a boy, had thalidomide deformities, which were obviously much more noticeable than my own. That if the person was trying to draw their attention to something else, unfortunately, you would only see the hands. And that is what the Mishnah is trying to avoid. It's not trying to denigrate or insult those who have these particular disabilities, deformities, maladies, and all sorts of other conditions. Acknowledging the truth of the limitations of most people, which is most people in certain circumstances cannot see past the person if the person stands out beyond a certain level. And that, unfortunately, would then break what we're trying to teach, because the last thing we want people to do, the priest who is giving the blessing, right? The priest is meant to be a pipe. They are meant to be featureless, like a tube that the blessing from God is flowing through. And if you're focused on the tube, then you now think it's responsible for the blessing, and you've now shortchanged God. So it is ironic that anything that distracts, anything that makes the Kohen stand out too much as an individual is taking away from what God is trying to achieve through this blessing, which could very easily be misunderstood by the masses. What do we think with this? Difficult? Yeah, it's hard because we want to think that we're better than this, right? We want to think, no, I wouldn't do that. You know, if I saw the priest get up there and they had, you know, one hand that was like a claw and the other hand was covered in stains and welts and sores, I would still be totally focused on Yivarechecha, on the blessing that they were given.
Blue hands would really stand out.
They would probably really stand out, yes. So how honest do we have to be about human nature? And then how much do we have to give up for human nature? You know, if the Kohen in your town is like this, is there going to be a way for us to have this blessing, or are we stuck because we're not able to see past him to God? It's something that we should still be thinking about even in these days when our hands are not usually dyed by woad. But we do still often have difficulty when we see somebody who is in a wheelchair or who is on crutches or has other forms of visible disabilities. Many people do have trouble seeing past them to being the person that they are individually, to the job that they are trying to accomplish, or anything that makes them more than the condition that is standing out in front of them. That's not something that we have overcome by any stretch of the imagination yet. As modern and advanced as we are, we still often get hung up when we see somebody who has a different set of capabilities than we're used to. So I think I understand. Again, I wish we did not have this in our psyche that was limiting us, but I don't see this going away yet. God willing, it'll go away eventually. To see people as they really are rather than just the casing that they have. All right, we'll leave the Mishnah there for now. Those of you want to stick around for a little discussion of kashrut, we'll give it some time.